All right, so here we go with the second half of chapter 4. So I'm going to get this going. There we go. We just finished talking about the major layers of the skin. We talked about mostly just the epidermis in the first half of this chapter. So now we're going to move on to the dermis. It's pointed out on this slide. So again, keep this slide nearby because we'll talk about the layers of the dermis, the papillary layer and reticular layer. And then we'll finish with the hypodermis, some age-related changes to skin, and then also skin repair in response to damage. So between the epidermis and the hypodermis, there's the dermis, this middle layer in the skin where there's two fiber types, elastic fibers that stretch and recoil to their original length that allows flexibility in the dermis. So in this outermost layer, in any layer actually in the dermis, you'll find elastic fibers. That makes your skin kind of elastic. You can kind of pull on it and stretch it and it'll go back to its original shape. And collagen fibers are super strong. They don't branch, they resist stretching, but they bend easily. So these will limit flexibility in the dermis. If you've ever heard of collagen on like commercials and things for skincare products, your skin produces collagen. As you get older, it doesn't produce collagen as well, and the integrity of those fibers declines. So that's what we end up getting wrinkles as we get older, because collagen and elastic fibers aren't as good at their job as they used to be. The papillary layer, the outermost layer, so most superficial layer of the dermis, named after the dermal papillae. Remember those bumps that attach directly to the epidermis by way of the epidermal ridges? That's composed of areolar connective tissue or loose connective tissue. And here you can find capillaries and lymphatic vessels, sensory receptors, neurons, and touch receptors that, again, if you touch your skin, you can feel that. And so those touch receptors are located there as well. The reticular layer, the deeper layer, is a mesh network of dense, irregular connective tissue. Remember, the fibers there are all irregularly kind of run in a bunch of different directions. So that type of tissue can resist force or resist stretching or compression in a number of different directions. The collagen fibers there basically blend into both the papillary layer and the above and the hypodermis below, which kind of keeps this tissue really tightly connected to the layer above in the papillary layer and also to the tissue below in the hypodermis. And there's more blood vessels, nerves, and accessory organs. We'll talk about some sweat glands and other glands that are located there that are accessory structures in the integumentary system. The hypodermis separates the skin from deeper structures, so anything below, like muscle or organs and things like that. Stabilizes the position of the skin to the underlying tissue, so it's an anchor for the skin to everything below it. It's often dominated by fat tissue or adipose tissue, and it's a major storage site in your body for storing energy. Fat is a major storage molecule. It is the major storage molecule in your body. So you have a significant amount of fat tissue under the skin in the hypodermis or the subcutaneous layer. Vitamin D is so incredibly important. Exposure to the sun is what stimulates vitamin D synthesis in the skin. So there's a relationship that you're going to have with the sun where you can get some sun exposure to get enough vitamin D synthesis, but not too much sun exposure to get skin or sun damage from the skin, in the skin, that we talked about in the previous lecture, the first part of this chapter. So sunlight in epidermal cells in the stratum spinosum and the stratum basale convert a steroid compound into vitamin D. So remember, the stratum spinosum and the stratum basale are the two deepest layers of the epidermis. The stratum basale being the deepest layer, and the stratum spinosum being the next layer up. So the stratum basale, remember, is basal cells that divide and continue to move into and become the stratum spinosum, and then eventually the stratum granulosum, stratum lucidum, and the stratum corneum, those outer and more outer layers. That vitamin that's produced in those deeper layers diffuses across the basement membrane. Remember, basement membranes attach epithelial tissue, anchor epithelial tissue to the tissue below it, and that vitamin diffuses into capillaries. So now it's in the bloodstream. You can get most of your vitamin D should come from sunlight. You need about 15 minutes of sun exposure to most of your body a day to get enough vitamin D for you. That's not always ideal depending on where you live or how much sunscreen you wear or how much clothing you wear. So you can also get it from your diet, from fish oils, and shellfish. There's also like milk and orange juice can be fortified with vitamin D. Some tuna is really good, high in vitamin D, like canned tuna. You can look on certain cans and find vitamin D listed on their food labels. Milk is more oftentimes fortified with both calcium and vitamin D, because vitamin D is necessary to get calcium absorbed from where you eat it into your body. And the liver itself, so vitamin D that's produced in the skin or that's consumed from your diet, is sent to the liver, is transported by the blood to the liver, where it's produced, basically converted to an intermediary product that's not active yet. For it to become active, that intermediary product is sent by way of the bloodstream from the liver to the kidney. And that is converted to a molecule called calcitriol, which is the most active form of vitamin D that can increase calcium absorption in the intestine, through the intestine. And then once calcium is absorbed, calcium gets stored in bone, is used for growth. Calcium is so important in the body. There's so many different functions of calcium. It doesn't just get stored in bone. It helps make bone hard and strong, but it also is involved in the nervous system and in muscle contraction. There's so many jobs of calcium. It's so important. So if you're deficient in vitamin D, you'll likely be deficient in calcium in some way. And you can have brittle bones or weak bones. You could have nervous system problems. Lots of different things can happen by not having enough calcium or not having enough vitamin D. So it's really important. There's a figure here just describing kind of how all that happens, what we just talked about on the previous slide. So if you want to rewind the video at all and just keep this figure nearby and then go back through the kind of wordy slides that we just talked about, that would be helpful in studying. I went the wrong way. There we go. So inadequate vitamin D, I mentioned, may cause problems with calcium absorption, may inhibit calcium absorption. So if you don't have enough exposure to sunlight, and you don't have enough in your diet, enough vitamin D in your diet, you can have inadequate amounts, which means which will lead to inadequate amount of calcium and both phosphorus in the bone, which can lead to weak or brittle bones, so that and flexible bones. So this figure here shows you an example of rickets. Rickets is a disease that's basically characterized by vitamin D deficiency. And because vitamin D is deficient in these individuals, calcium absorption is inhibited, and not enough calcium is getting into the body, and the bones here in the lower legs tend to bow. And they bow because there's not enough calcium. Calcium, remember, makes bone hard and makes bone strong and stiff. So without that calcium, it becomes flexible. Bones become flexible. Accessory organs in the skin are hair follicles, exocrine glands, we'll get into specifics there, and the nail. So there's a couple there's a figure here that just kind of illustrates the accessory structures there, and we'll get into some details like the hair. It's found almost everywhere in the body. It's produced by a hair follicle. The follicle is composed of epithelial and connective tissues, and the components of the hair are listed here. We'll talk about them: the shaft, the root, and the hair plexus. And you can see that root hair plexus, this is a nerve plexus as opposed to a vascular or blood vessel plexus. The root, the shaft here, is basically the hair that pokes out and you can see on your skin or see on your head. That's the shaft of the hair, and the root is basically where the hair resides. It anchors the hair into your skin. And this muscle, there's a muscle associated here. It's called the erector pili muscle. When this muscle, it's smooth muscle, so it's not under your voluntary control. But when you get cold, you get goosebumps, that muscle is contracting and bumping up your skin to help increase how much heat you can suck in to your skin from your environment. So the papillae, in a structure of a hair, there's a papillae, this bump here. And a papillae is really just a bump. So we talked about dermal papillae in the dermis, like this bump here is a dermal papillae. This is a dermal papillae. Right here is the papillae. That's basically connective tissue filled with tons of blood vessels and nerves at the base of the follicle. The matrix is the area where hair grows. So you can see the matrix right here. The medulla, anytime you have a medulla of a structure in your body, it's the innermost area of that structure. So the medulla is the core, basically the center of the hair matrix. And the cortex is the layer that is just deep to the cuticle. It's an intermediate layer. So it's a layer between the cuticle, this kind of outermost layer here of the hair. The cortex, this area there, is this middle layer. So innermost layer is medulla, then cortex, and the outermost layer is basically the surface of the hair is the cuticle. Hair color is also due to melanin. So remember we talked about melanin that is responsible for skin pigment and skin color, one of the two pigments. Keratin is the other. So basically variations in hair color are also due to the amount of melanin production. Different forms of melanin also can produce dark brown or yellowish brown or even red hair. Pigment production declines with age, which is why hair color gets lighter and even white from the lack of pigment. So when melanin production stops completely, hair becomes white. Sebaceous glands, they discharge this substance called sebum. It's what makes your skin oily. Basically, it's a mixture of triglycerides, which are lipids, cholesterol, which is also a lipid, proteins, and electrolytes like sodium and potassium. It coats your hair and the surrounding epidermal surfaces to provide lubrication. And it keeps the shaft of the hair from becoming too dry and brittle so your hair doesn't break off. It also has antibacterial properties, so it's protective of you. It's actually supposed to be produced. It's good for you to have sebum production. Oily skin this antibacterial property is wonderful for your skin. Contraction of the erector pili muscle squeezes the sebaceous gland and forces sebum into the hair follicle. So not only does the erector pili muscle cause goosebumps, but in doing so, as it contracts ever so slightly, it can force sebum out into the hair follicle from the actual gland. So here's a sebaceous gland. This whole gland, these sebaceous follicles, they look like a tree or an upside down tree to me. And that sebaceous gland is kind of tree-like in shape, and it always has a duct that secretes that sebum, is able to secrete that sebum into the hair shaft. So it's always associated with the hair follicle or very nearby. Sweat glands, there's two different types. One of them is associated with the hair follicle, just like sebaceous glands, and one is not. It actually secretes sweat right under the surface of the skin as opposed to into the hair follicle. The apocrine sweat gland is found in armpits, the pubic region, for example. It secretes sweat into the hair follicle itself. Produces this kind of sticky, it's basically responsible for body odor. When that sweat gland produces sweat, the body odor that you smell in response to that is because of sweat being produced from this particular type of gland and the type of secretion it produces. A merocrine sweat gland is found pretty much anywhere else in the body, but high in concentration in palms and soles. So you get nervous and your palms get sweaty, these merocrine glands are going crazy. But they secrete sweat right to the surface of the skin as opposed to into the hair follicle. It's more of a watery secretion with like sodium and potassium, the electrolytes, that helps regulate body temperature. So one of the reasons you're able to regulate body temperature is by way of the erector pili muscle producing goosebumps, but also by sweating. If you get too hot, you sweat, and as air passes by your skin, it helps cool off your body by way of convection. So I want to say that's nails. I'm going to flip back for a second. I want to show you way back, way back. Hang on, not there. Not there. In the figure of the skin, of the entire integumentary system, you should be able to identify an apocrine versus a merocrine sweat gland. I was hoping to have a figure here, and I don't think I do. So we're going to talk about the nail and then talk about the last couple of accessory structures as we finish up this chapter. But if you have the figure from the first half of the chapter that we talked about quite a bit, you have an example of an apocrine and a merocrine sweat gland. Just remember that apocrine sweat glands secrete sweat into the hair follicle, and merocrine sweat glands secrete sweat right onto the skin, or excretes right onto the skin. So that's how you can tell them apart. They look the same. The glands themselves appear the same, but their ducts empty, basically send sweat to different areas. The nail protects the tip of your fingers and your toes. So it's a protective structure. It has a nail body, bed, and cuticle that we're going to talk about. Basically, the nail body is thick sheets of dead keratinized epidermal cells. So part of the epidermis basically forms the nail body. The bed is an area of the epidermis under the nail body that where the nail production actually occurs from the root. And then the cuticle is the portion of the stratum corneum of the nail that extends over the nail root. So it's lots going on. And that little pale arch that you can see at the base of your nail is the lanula. So here's structures. Right here is the lanula, that little kind of pale half moon shape, where the cuticle is kind of this epidermal kind of layer that meets up with the bed of the nail, at the lanula. And that's what you can actually see. You can look at your own nails. It's just a kind of thin layer of skin that covers the base of this cuticle, or this lanula. Sometimes it's thicker, sometimes it's thinner. The cuticle here, you can see, is pointed out. I have a couple things highlighted. In the nail body, the nail bed is underneath that. So it's kind of, think about where you would lie in a bed. The nail body lies on top of the bed. And then the cuticle is here, where you can see that kind of the skin itself meets with the nail. Right there would be the lanula. You can see the cuticle here as well. Age-related changes in the skin. Melanocyte activity declines, so the skin is much more sensitive to sun exposure, so you're more likely to burn as you get older. Sebaceous glands secrete less sebum, so the skin tends to be dry and cracked and scaly. That increases the risk of injury. There's weakened connections between the epidermis and dermis, and a decline in vitamin D production. So the cells and the cells of the stratum basale divide slower. So you don't renew skin, you don't heal as quickly as you would at a younger age. Other age-related changes: decreasing in the number of dendritic cells, those cells that are involved in the immune response in the skin. So you're more susceptible to disease. The dermis actually thins out and has fewer elastic fibers, so skin gets saggy and wrinkly. American sweat glands are less active, so you're more likely to overheat. Older individuals are much more sensitive to heat stroke, or much more susceptible to heat stroke, which is why it's so important in the summer months when it's really hot to make sure that air conditioning is good and you stay a little bit less active. And in your older years, and blood supply is actually reduced, which basically also affects temperature regulation. I mentioned skin repair slows. The hair follicles stop functioning, so your hair if it is produced at all, it produces thinner hair. It tends to be white because melanocyte activity decreases or even stops. And then estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, the sex hormones, tend to be lower as we get older, and that alters basically hair and fat distribution. So there's some age-related changes. This is kind of a summary slide here. And then integument repair. So injury to skin causes basically bleeding and then release of a cell called a mast cell. Mast cells produce chemicals that cause inflammation. Inflammation is good in your body. It's supposed to isolate the injury, but also recruit other cells to the site of infection. So after several hours, you get a blood clot or a scab that forms at the surface. You're not supposed to pick those off. Cells of the stratum basale start to migrate toward the edge of the wound. Remember, the stratum basale is that basal layer that divides and can basically regenerate the epithelial tissue there. So that starts that process. Macrophages are cells that eat debris, basically. They are cells of the body that can consume or eat basically debris or other cells that attack other cells that aren't supposed to be there. And if the damage is so deep that the dermis is affected, fibroblasts secrete collagen. Blood clotting occurs, so you can start to repair the collagen in the dermis as well, and start the repair process. After about a week, the scab basically gets replaced by the migrating epidermal cells, the cells of the stratum basale that start to produce new skin. Phagocytic activity is almost complete, so the infection should be clear. Any infection or any damaged cells or debris should be cleared. The blood clot should disintegrate, and fibroblasts have formed collagen and ground substance. Remember, ground substance is the fluid component of connective tissue. So you're basically just repairing and replacing the damaged tissue. And those fibroblasts would be located in the dermis. Same thing with the ground substance. So the dermis repair would be this bullet point here. This would mostly be epidermal repair. After several weeks, the scab is gone. The epidermis is complete and healed and repaired and brand new. There's a shallow depression that we'll talk about that is your scar that marks your injury site. And fibroblasts continue to create scar tissue that tends to be inflexible, fibrous, and non-cellular materials. So just mostly fibers, collagen fibers. There's a figure that describes that or kind of consolidates that, summarizes that. This scar that I mentioned is basically part of tissue repair. Hair follicles, sebaceous glands, sweat glands, muscle cells, nerve cells, it's all replaced by just fibrous tissue, scar tissue, collagen fibers. The scar tissue is basically beyond repair at this point. It's called a keloid, and there's a figure of that here. You can see this individual. This is keloid scar tissue. It's basically harmless, but it's a raised, thickened mass of scar tissue that's covered by shiny, smooth epidermal surface. So there's no cells there other than epidermal cells and potentially connective tissue, the scar tissue. It's most common on the upper back, shoulders, and the chest, and even the earlobes. So that's irreparable scar tissue. All right, well, thanks for joining me for this chapter. If you have any questions, shoot me an email or we can start a Canvas discussion. Good luck studying. You've got exam 1 coming up, ready to take that next week. So you've got a quiz for chapter 4, no quiz for chapter 5, but chapter 5 material is listed for next week. It is not on exam 1. So exam 1 covers chapters 1, 3, and 4. So all the background information, and then tissue, cells and tissues, and the integumentary system. So good luck with that. Study hard, and I will see you soon.